Welcome to All About Agatha. This is part 2 of our very first episode about Agatha Christie's very first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. I'm Kemper Donovan, here with my co-host Catherine Brobeck, and to wrap up Styles, we're going to be speaking about the television adaptation of the novel and our ranking system for this book and all of Christie's books to come. Also, a brief programming note. In the future, we'll be doing one episode per novel, and our plan is to put out these podcasts regularly, once a week. We encourage our listeners to read the novels before downloading each episode, even if they've read them before, and we realize that a novel a week can be a tall order. So we'll be peppering our schedule with some extras along the way. Short stories Christie published, for example, or special occurrences in her life. Say, a real-life disappearance leading to a countrywide manhunt. We have so much more to come. And now, let's get back to Styles.
So let's move on to the adaptation of Mysterious Affair at Styles. And just a note on adaptations in general, because obviously a big part of Christie and Christie fandom are the adaptations of her novels, and there are a lot of them. So just in general on this podcast, we're only going to discuss film and television adaptations, not the stage and radio adaptations, unless for some reason those adaptations are particularly notable. So for The Mysterious Affair at Styles, we have a pretty simple situation. There was just one adaptation released by ITV in the UK. And as many listeners will know, they actually adapted every single Poirot story that Christie wrote between 1989 and 2013. And in the U.S., these aired on PBS as part of the much-loved Mystery! Series. So getting into this ITV Poirot starring the incomparable David Suchet as Hercule Poirot and Hugh Fraser as Arthur Hastings. It's interesting that this actually was not the first adaptation. It wasn't until the third season that it was adapted as the first episode. And honestly, having rewatched the episode after having reread the novel recently, I was pretty impressed by how faithful the adaptation really is. There are a few streamlining cuts that are made very quickly. There's no Dr. Bauerstein, which is honestly not a huge loss.
Also because it is an anti-Semitic caricature.
He is absolutely, which we will get to in a little bit. Cynthia, a lot of the red herring business about Cynthia in the books and her working at a dispensary is dispensed, pun intended, even though it's not really a pun. And also Mrs. Inglethorpe in this adaptation is the natural mother of John and Lawrence Cavendish, not their stepmother. And honestly, I would add that it seems like Christie herself forgot that distinction by the time she wrote Curtain, which is her last Poirot, and which takes place at Styles. And her last book. So I'm not going to be too hard on ITV for not making that distinction. So I guess, is there anything, Catherine, how do you feel about this adaptation?
I think
what do you want to say about it?
I am, the weird thing is, okay, I'm restarting this. So unlike you, I saw the television series before I ever read the books, because the television series I used to watch like sitting against my mom when I was like a small child. And so some of these I had to revisit. And
it's like a painting. I can imagine a painting of Domestic Bliss.
Yeah, it just is exactly that. Like Murder, She Wrote and Mystery on PBS. Anyway, yes, apparently just like Domestic Bliss was watching people get offed. So this really swayed me. Because by the time I started reading them, I had spent years watching them. And so for me, I actually have no visual interpretation of what Captain Hastings or Poirot look like that aren't Hugh Fraser and David Suchet. And no matter how hard I try as a reader to picture them differently I can't. It's not possible. This is like burned into my brain from the time I was like a small child. So for me, watching it was like, oh yes, here, yes, this is exactly right. This is exactly like what I read.
This is it.
But yeah,
this is the story.
This is the story because it almost was hard for me to actually even parse the differences because, yeah, I mean, oh, well, my brain goes into a lock at seeing those two actors and seeing Philip Jackson as Inspector Japp, who, let's talk about, he's described as, I think, weasel-faced, right?
Yeah, he's described as little, I think dark, little, and ferret-like.
Yeah.
In the book, which I was shocked by too, because I mean, unlike Catherine, I did read the books before I watched the adaptations for, if not all of them, then the majority of them. But David Suchet and Hugh Fraser, I think both because they're as good as they are, and because every single possible Poirot story has been adapted, have really overtaken my visual as well. Not the case with Miss Marple, which we'll get to, because there have been so many different Miss Marples.
Even I feel differently about that, but I can't say that about Poirot. So even when I watched later on the 1970s Albert Finney as Poirot, Murder on the Orient Express feature film with famous people, I had a very hard time thinking that was Poirot, because for me, David Suchet is Poirot. He's been Poirot almost as long as I've been alive. And that is, I think, a significant achievement, and I think it's a significant factor into the popularity and the ongoing popularity of the books. And so watching Styles, like, I actually had a bit of a hard time being objective, because for me, they were just acting out, exactly what the story was.
Well, so I have two things to say to that. One is there's this article that Lucy Mangan wrote for The Guardian. It's actually quite a while ago. It was on the 1st of October in 2010. But she, at that point, it was the 120th anniversary of Agatha Christie's birth. And she went to a Christie festival, and she was struck by the fact that Christie fans don't really differentiate between those who have just watched the adaptations and those who have read the books. And that is unusual. It's not necessarily the case among other author fan clubs and festivals and whatnot.
I would make an argument, just because, of course, I'm going to make this argument. The only other exception to that, I think, is Inspector Morse. It's for similar reasons. And I mean, it's not that they're having an Inspector Morse festival, but the fact that literally there are still versions. This endeavor is still on the air. And that a lot of people who really, really are committed to its continued run possibly have never read the Colin Dexter books. But I mean, I think that I think that those are maybe the only two exceptions to this.
Right. No, I'm saying it's unusual.
Yeah.
I watched the TV series and people say that's cool.
Right. Yeah. And you're just like, yeah, no, you're a Christie fan.
Right. And I will be honest, and I guess this comes from the fact that I read the books before the TV show, and even though I'm a huge devoted fan to the Suchet, Poirot, and various adaptations, I kind of think that's crap. I think if you're a true Agatha Christie fan, you need to read the books. Just gonna say it.
I disagree with you, but
fair enough.
I disagree with you, but I do understand your point. I mean, I actually am going to be completely honest. I feel a little bit that way with people who say that they read a book and it turns out they listened to it on Audible. I think that there is an important factor, almost to me, to read the Christie books in print. And it's partially the illustrations and no good reader versions, but also because I think this goes with me towards the adaptation, that when I read them, my mom owned all of them in like 1970s paperbacks from when she was in college. And I will 100% admit that the tagged, highlighted version of the Mysterious Ferret Styles that I read when we did this podcast was sent to me by my mom, and it was the same version. It's the exact same book that I read when I was probably in 4th grade. And
wow.
Yeah, and I mean, and so there's a tactileness to, you know, reading a sort of aged paperback, and there's a tactileness to the adaptation. And it's thoroughly unmodern, right? It has none of the gloss. It has pretty high production values for being 1980s or early 1990s British television. They clearly invested money in the production. It has a sense of place, not in that it depicts styles necessarily as having a sense of place, but the actual show has this sense of time to it that you, like, can completely situate it within this context of PBS.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, and it's actually really... Yeah, absolutely, and it is interesting that we're starting with it may not be the only one, but it's one of the few of these Poirot adaptations that does not actually take place in 1936, because ITV essentially just made the decision to set all of the Poirots in the same mid-war year, which I think was a great idea because it did give them this, it created a sense of place for the series as a whole, and it gave it this sense of continuity that's very comforting, and it's just so easily identifiable. And I feel like Christie would have been a fan of that. But the books, certainly, I mean, the books change with the times depending on when that book was written, and that's a big difference. But Styles is the one adaptation rather that is actually set in the time in which the book is set, which is, of course, during World War I.
It's jarring almost because their clothes are so much different than the clothes that you would be used to in the rest of the run of the show.
Yeah.
And...
Well, except for Poirot. Poirot always looks the same.
Well, because, I mean... His suit must smell so bad. I mean, like, imagine, how many versions of that suit do you think Poirot owns? Because I can't imagine very many, and I can't imagine that there was, like, super heavy laundering by him. I mean, he gets, if memory serves, he gets a quote-unquote valet in later novels, or at least in the TV show. Maybe not in the books, but at least in the television show.
Certainly in the TV series, Georges, the valet, appears. I don't know if he does in the books. I don't
know that he does in the books either. But saying that we literally never see Poirot in a different outfit. He's a little bit like, I imagine him as like Doug from the 1990s television series Doug, where Doug would open his closet and it would just be like the same cartoon green sweater vest and like khaki shorts.
Or like how Smurfette had a rack of the same dresses, like her closet was just like a rack
it's a cartoon character trope.
Okay, so two things I just want to cover in this, and my apologies because this is so pedantic, but we know for sure, again, we went over the fact that dates are extremely important in this book, and there is no question that the murder happens on July 17th. We later learn from Curtin, the last book, that the year, which is not mentioned at any point in the Mysterious Affair of Styles, even though we know we're in the middle of World War I, but we find out unequivocally that from Curtin that the year was 1916. So this murder happened on July 17th, 1916, and yet in this adaptation, when there's sort of a statement being read out in court, the date of the murder is stated unequivocally as being June 19th, 1917. And I just thought that was weird. That's all.
I mean, I guess they weren't tracking continuity.
I guess they weren't, and I might be the only person that cares. The other thing I just want to point out, and perhaps this is kind of obvious, but that's also kind of the point, is that the scene in which Hastings talks about wanting to be a detective and having met Poirot, who who was a detective that he knows, is reproduced very faithfully in this adaptation, with the exception of the fact that Sherlock Holmes is not mentioned at all. And it's funny that in the book, as you were saying, Catherine, she's using Sherlock Holmes as a shorthand almost to telegraph to readers, okay, this is what you're going to get. Certainly by the early 90s, to people watching The Mysterious Affair at Styles at home, there was no reason to mention Holmes to telegraph anything because Christie had already become a brand in and of herself. So there we go. So there were also two scenes I wanted to highlight, mainly for their comedic elements. One is this tender moment between Poirot and Hastings when Poirot pastes the beard that was used to impersonate Alfred Inglethorpe onto Hastings's face. And it's weird. So let's take a listen to that.
Good Lord. Hold it up to your face, Hastings. Do you think it's the one? I do. It is trimmed exactly to the same shape as the beard of Monsieur Inglethorpe. The question is, who put it there?
It strikes me as this very, to use a 21st century term, bromantic moment, homoerotic, if you will. And I can't help wondering if there were to be another kind of Suchet Fraser pairing now, if it wouldn't be as unabashedly homoerotic as, for example, the Cumberbatch-Freeman pairing is in Sherlock.
Well, I would like to alert you to the fact that if you Google for Poirot Hastings fan fiction, you get a lot of it that's like very G-rated, like solving an investigation. But let me just point out, somebody heard your Cumberbatch Freeman Sherlock bromance comment, and yeah, they took it to the NC-17 level.
Yeah, so Google at your peril.
Don't Google. Not recommended unless you want your eyes to burn out. Do not recommend. I think the answer to your question is no, because the entire essence of Poirot is so asexual that it's counterintuitive
I suppose. I think it would at least be there would be an undercurrent of discomfort at some point somewhere. Perhaps it's just they don't even go there at any point in the series, which is, I mean, it's part of what's so charming about the series.
Well, they sort of frame it a little bit, I believe, in the later episodes, is that it always seems that perhaps Captain Hastings has a bit of bit of affection for Miss Lemon, or that somebody had. I don't know if I ever
thought that. No.
Well, I guess maybe she's the only woman in most of the adaptations, so I just assumed. Shout out to Pauline Moran.
Yeah. So the other thing the other scene I wanted to highlight was at the climax of the story when Poirot outs the murderers, Alfred and Evelyn. In the book, it certainly is a dramatic scene. And by the way, just a sidebar here, but in the original version of the novel, Christie actually had Poirot revealing everything in court through testimony, and all of the readers which would make more sense, but apparently her rendering of the trial overall was so rang so false to readers and just seemed so inauthentic that they asked for that scene to be taken out of the trial. So Christie apparently just lifted it and plopped it into a drawing room. But of course, that became a staple of the genre. So it's interesting that was
the staple of every single one of her books.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that scene, in the adaptation, it's a little bit more over the top than it is in the book.
All right. We love each other.
Take them away, Inspector Japp.
You think we were going to sit and wait for the old bitch to die? We deserve the money anyway.
And I'm not sorry. I'm not the least little bit sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think they
just
needed a dramatic lift at the end, right?
Sure. I don't know if calling her the old bitch and caressing and Evelyn caressing Alfred's tummy in sort of awkward fashion with a close-up on the caressing was entirely necessary, but it's one of those weird over-the-top moments that you kind of get with this series sometimes, and it makes me love it.
The only other thing that I would note is that the first time we're introduced to her on camera, she's forefronted when Hastings isn't. And it's also the first introduction to the house. So, I mean, they're very clearly telegraphing her significance from literally the first shot that she's in a way that the book does not do.
It's interesting. Okay, so we're finally at the final section of the podcast, ranking. So here's what we're trying to do with the ranking. And I'm actually going to turn again to our favorite curmudgeon, Edmund Wilson, who had a rather succinct but effective statement for what makes a good detective novel. Here's what he said. It is not difficult to create suspense by making people await a revelation, but it does demand a certain talent to come through with a criminal device which is ingenious or picturesque or amusing enough to make the reader feel that the waiting has been worthwhile. So that's what we're really ranking here, I think, or at least I think that's what's at the heart of it. Was it worth it? You know, was it worth going through the contortions of the mystery puzzle to get to the other side and get to the solution? Do we feel like this was time well spent? And since we're going through all 66 of Agatha Christie's novels, we thought that actually assigning a numerical value would be the easiest way to keep track of how they stack up against each other. So here's how we're going to do it. We've got 5 different elements of the story that we're going to score on a scale of 1 to 10. The first one, which I'll take, is mystery puzzle mechanics. And what that's asking is, are the clues fairly presented? Are there so many red herrings, for example, thrown in that it's ridiculous, which is certainly not the case in Styles? Does solving the clues require such expert knowledge that it doesn't seem fair? That's where I have a little bit of an issue with the bromide powders. Are there any logic mistakes? Perhaps the error that I think I uncovered with John Cavendish not noticing Cynthia's door didn't open up could be a mistake. Is the solution pleasingly clever? In the case of Styles, I would say it's extremely clever. We not only have a double bluff, but a double jeopardy situation going on. So I would say that on the whole, for mystery puzzle mechanics, Styles scores an 8 out of 10.
So,
Catherine?
Then we're going to talk about credibility. As in, do the theoretically human characters act like reasonable human characters in the course of the novel? Or are the contortions such that really you just lose credibility? And, I mean, Alfred Inglethorpe, just shove the letter, in your pocket. You would have literally
Seriously.
gotten away scot-free had you not put it on a counter for Hercule Poirot to find. So, yeah, no. We're 4 out of 10. I actually would almost go lower, but I think we've agreed on 4 out of 10.
4 out of 10. I think that's fair.
All right.
There's a lot of good human-like actions that come before the failure to stuff a piece of paper in your pants.
Human-like actions. That's really the parameter here.
So the next two elements are essentially about character, but we're dividing them up into two different categories. The first are the detectives and those surrounding the detective, by which we mean sidekicks, such as Hastings, or police inspectors, such as Japp. How are all these people rendered? And for future novels, in the case of Poirot, like, does that novel add something interesting to what we already know about that detective, or about Hastings, or about Japp? Does it deepen that character in any way? And in this case, since Styles is the first of the Poirot books, the first time that we're meeting Poirot and Hastings and Japp, we can't help giving it a big score. Christie really did the heavy lifting in this story, and even though you could potentially argue that she cribbed from Holmes and Watson,
and Lestrade,
she did it really well. And Lestrade, that's true. Lestrade as the Japp prototype. She did it well, so we're going to give her an 8 out of 10 here.
As for the characters who are not Poirot, Hastings, and Japp, the question is if they're cardboardy per James. Do they?
For P.D. James, yeah.
Yeah. Do they hold our interest? I mean, no. The answer is no. You know, she wins us over because she's just granted us the privilege of having Poirot for life. But unbeknownst to her, unfortunately, a different conversation that we can have. But, you know, that carries this. It is not the suspects or the victims, because really any emotional attachment is not there. So, yeah, 2.
2 out of 10. I think that's fair. Okay, and so the final category is setting and tone. Do the setting and or the tone add anything to the story? And despite that really nice floor plan of the bedroom floors, of the bedrooms on the second floor, it really doesn't. We just don't get that much in terms of setting and tone. It's not terrible. We have the bits of humor. Again, this is the first novel. Our detectives are getting introduced, so we're going to be kind and give it a 4 out of 10 for setting and tone.
And then our last point is probably the trickiest, and maybe we should have brought it up sooner. Talk.
As I like to say, we didn't save the best for last, we saved the worst for last.
We need to talk about the not timelessness. We'll call it not timelessness.
Sure.
It's a credit to Christie that there's not more of it, but there is a degree of racism and xenophobia and sexism that is a product of its time and a product of who she was, and it's hard to overlook some of it. You know, some of it's
a product of the world she was living in and grew up in.
Right. I mean, I don't think either of us thinks that she was like, I don't actually think she was like actively racist or actively sexist. I mean, she loved the Middle East. You know, she loved exploring it. I mean, admittedly in a Great British Empire kind of way, but clearly she was a successful woman on her own. I don't think she was a sexist, but like, that does not stop the fact that reading some of the passages get to be uncomfortable if you're in 2016.
Yeah. And it's not something, to be clear, I just want to add, it's not something that we're singling out Agatha Christie for. I mean, there are the bulk of writers from the period when she was writing. If you go back and revisit their work, which just honestly doesn't get done as often as Christie's is because she's more popular than everyone else, you'd have the same reaction. And that's why it's really this quality of being stuck in the time in which it was written. And even though we're not singling her out for it, I think it's fair to read that as a failure, or certainly as a detriment to a book that is working in other ways.
I would point out, namely, the costume box. The costume box it's really the red herring that Lawrence and Cynthia really love the costume box. They like to entertain the family with little plays they have since they were children. That's also where Poirot and Hastings find the beard that Evie used. So Dorcas, the beloved servant, is describing the dressing up box, and all of this is to the red herring plot. But she says, in describing the Cavendish's performances, Mr. Lawrence, he's wonderful, most comic. I shall never forget the night he came down as the Tsar of Persia, I think he called it. A sort of Eastern king it was. He had the big paper knife in his hand. And, mind, Dorcas, he says, you'll have to be very respectful. This is my specially sharpened scimitar, and it's off with your head if I'm at all displeased with you. Miss Cynthia, she was what they call an Apache, or some such name. A Frenchified sort of cutthroat, I take it to be. A real sight she looked. You'd never have believed a pretty young lady like that could have made herself into such a ruffian. Nobody would have known her. Then, 2 paragraphs later, she mentioned, there was a red wig, I know, but nothing else in the way of hair. Burnt corks they used mostly, though. 'Tis messy getting it off. Miss Cynthia was a N-word once, and oh, the trouble she had.
Yeah, we've got the casual dropping of the N-word there.
Yep, and also the fact that the Cavendish family had as entertainment blackface.
Yeah. Yep.
that was how they spent their evenings entertaining each other. So, I mean, it's a little bit of a problem.
That's a little bit of a problem. There's also a bit of a through line with the farmer's widow, who is the one that keeps on getting mentioned as potentially having an affair with both/either John Cavendish and Alfred Inglethorpe.
Who's a gypsy?
Yeah, she's often mentioned as a gypsy, which is essentially supposed to, I think, associate her with having perhaps lower standards than a true gentlewoman. And, there's a fair amount of sexism if it's coming from either Hastings's objectification of women, or Poirot in his fussy sort of French way is often making comments about women and, about Cynthia. He says she's clever. Oh, yes, she has brains, that little one, which, certainly comes off in a patronizing way. We also...
Although I do think Poirot, because, of course, I'm apparently the Christie defender in this podcast. I think that when Poirot generally says that, when Poirot compliments anyone, I actually think that you should take it as a compliment. Like, I think that it's intended as one. Yeah, it's patronizing, but, I think that Poirot actually does respect Miss Cynthia. Mm-hmm. Mademoiselle Cynthia.
Yeah, that's kind of the definition of patronizing.
Okay, I mean, touche, but I mean, it could be worse. He could be disrespecting her in the way that I think that a lot of the men in this novel do treat the other women.
True.
And the anti-Semitism is not great.
Anti-Semitism isn't great. Dr. Bauerstein is identified in a negative way by John Cavendish as being a Polish Jew. And we, ultimately learn about him, by the way, that he is actually a German spy. Again, this is happening in pre-World War, during World War I. Haven't even gotten close to World War II yet.
And Inglethorpe, he is identified visually as having dark hair and a dark beard and being overall slightly otherish.
Yeah. I think in general, it's this sort of, and this is what And in some ways, not that it's, I had forgotten what this felt and sounded like until I revisited this book, but Christie just she exemplifies this British exceptionalism and insularity. And the best way that I can get at this is there's this short little exchange between Hastings and Mary Cavendish, in which this happens right after he learns that she's actually half Russian. And he says, now I understand. And she says, understand what? And he responds, a hint of something foreign, different, that there has always been about you. And it's just this idea that if you're anything other than just full-on British, to the core, you're different, and that's noted. And not that it's necessarily a bad thing, not that it means that you're less of a person, but it might. And it's
But I mean, I
significant.
think you need to be clearer about that. I think it's not even that you're full on British; it's that you're English.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, and it's Hastings is an interesting vehicle to put that comment through, because he just seems to constantly be trying to sort of modulate whatever it is he's saying and his position so that he fits in, right? Like, he wants to even fit in with Poirot. He gets, very resentful in various places when, his comments aren't being taken in the light that he wants them to be taken in.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, I think that that's essentially almost the commentary. It's that it's not that you can't have an other, because clearly the hero of the story is Poirot, and he is very different than anybody else.
Yeah, but
that-
I would push back against that, because I actually think that's a classic exception that proves the rule kind of a thing. It's like, in general, foreigners are not great, but we have this one brilliant detective who, yes, he happens to not be one of us, but that's what makes him so interesting. It's not.
No,
I don't think he is
that's for sure true. That's for sure true.
I don't think it's like she's sort of saying, and now let's open up our minds to all of these other non-British.
No. I mean, you're
English.
completely right. He is the exception.
Yeah. But it is.
And I mean, I guess it's why
Sorry, go
he's
ahead.
ultimately exceptional, right? Like, why she treats him as exceptional, as much as she eventually comes to regret that. Spoiler alert, Agatha Christie eventually hated Hercule Poirot.
And called him a creep. But we'll get there.
Yeah.
We'll get there. So for racism, xenophobia, sexism, again, lack of timelessness, we, out of a possible 10 points to deduct, we are going to deduct 5 points. So basically,
I think that's us being generous.
I think that is us being generous, but there's a whole lot more of that in books to come. So basically,
including the one that was titled with the N word.
yeah. So we'll get there. So a perfect score would be 10, obviously 10 out of 10 for all 5 categories, and 0 out of 10 deductions, or 50 points. Styles is getting 8 plus 4 plus 8 plus 2 plus 4 minus 5, or 21, which means absolutely nothing, because it's our first and we have nothing to compare it to. But we will soon, and we invite our listeners to interact with us and let us know how their ranking may differ. The best way to contact us is either through email, which is at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, or through various forms of social media. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Kemper at Kemper Donovan, or Catherine at Brobcat, B-R-O-B Cat. You can also find us on Instagram at allaboutthedame. And we would also please ask you to rate and review us on iTunes, which will really help us, especially in these early episodes, in terms of getting out the word. Finally, we wanted to make a special thank you to Josh Blaker for designing our lovely logo.
We will see you all next week when we plan on discussing less nervously. So thank you guys for tolerating us in our first podcast. But then we discussed the secret adversary, which is our first Tommy and Tuppence, and then damn Agatha's first Tommy and Tuppence. Get hype.
I'm excited. I like Tommy and Tuppence.
You would.